Welcome to Mission Majjhima. Ajahn.
Ajahn.
So Ajahn, tell us about Majjhima Nikaya 75, the Magandiya Sutta.
So this sutta features some of the most evocative similes in the whole of the Pali canon. It starts off with the Buddha staying in the Kuru country of Kamasadama, and he's staying at a Brahmin's house, and is at the beginning he goes off for his alms round, but leaves the mat, that kind of grass mat where he was sleeping, and this wanderer of another sect named Magandiya comes and sees the mat laying out and assumes about it that this is an ascetic, and he kind of castigates the Brahmin and says, "Who is this? Whose mat is this destroyer of growth?" That's Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, or Bhante Sujato says, "Who is this baby killer?" An interpretation which Bhikkhu Bodhi has actually is killjoy. So the modern sense of a killjoy, someone who doesn't appreciate sensual pleasures. And this Magandiya, he is a paribhajika, a wanderer, but he also, in Majjhima 45, the Buddha talks about wanderers, paribhajika, who are of the view there is no danger in sensual pleasures. So you get, at least I get the picture that Magandiya is kind of like an ultimate, a super hippie, basically. Someone who just, wants to, wander around and experience all the beautiful sights and all the pleasant smells, taste, touch, etc. And the Buddha comes back, and the Buddha kind of speaks to Magandiya about this, and he says, "When you called me a destroyer of growth, were you referring to the fact that I have practiced restraint and teach the practice of restraint of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind to my disciples?" And Magandiya says, "Yes, that's exactly why I called you a killjoy, a destroyer of growth, is because you restrain this. You're basically telling me to put blinders on." And the Buddha says, formerly, when I was a prince, I had these 3 palaces and experienced all the pleasures of the world. But now that I have gone forth and experienced the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of jhana, I look back at those sensual pleasures and I don't envy people who get them. And then he says, "What do you think, Magandiya? Suppose there was a God who is enjoying all the celestial pleasures of heaven. Would they look down and envy just, even a king or a prince who's enjoying all the sensual things of the world?" And Magandiya says no. So too the Buddha says he himself has experienced greater pleasure and no longer envies just people who are experiencing the pleasures of the world. Then the Buddha gives these evocative similes. He gives 3 similes about lepers. And the first is about how a leper, once they're cured, no longer envies someone who is cauterizing themselves. And even though the leper might cauterize their skin, burn themselves to get rid of the pain, a healed leper doesn't envy someone who's experiencing that kind of pain. Secondly, there's the simile of a healed leper fearing fire, whereas like a person who's afflicted with leprosy will actually burn their own skin. A cured leper, if they were being dragged to a fire pit, would struggle against it. And it's the same fire both ways, but the cured leper no longer wants to be exposed to fire. Similarly, in the past, in the present, and in the future, sensual pleasures actually are, for a mind seeing correctly, painful. But it's that the leper, or us, have faculties which are seeing things incorrectly, or sensual pleasures actually are painful to an enlightened mind. The third simile is how a leper will, even though when they burn themselves and scratch their skin, or if you've ever had a mosquito bite, you just scratch. When you're a kid, you scratch more because you get some degree of satisfaction from the scratching. Whereas in actuality, that scratching is making the wound more infected, similarly, but to a greater extent with the leper. So too, there is this fact of the hedonic treadmill, or this is the fact of addiction. You've got this you need increasing stimula to get the previous dopamine hit that you were getting before. So it's a never-ending cycle of consumption and addiction. Then the Buddha gives a verse in Pali. He says that health is the highest gain and that nibbana is the highest happiness. And Magandiya hears this and he says, yes, right on. I've heard that too. I have that same belief. But the Buddha says, actually, this has just come down from old, but what is actually real health? And what is nibbana? And then he gives 3 similes of a blind person. So a blind person might be fooled by someone who gives them a dirty cloth saying that it's clean. So too, one might be fooled by teachings that say, okay, this is the path towards peace and purity, but it actually is not. It's a filthy teaching. Second simile of the blind person is a blind person who, even though a doctor might try to treat them, is not cured. So too, even if Magandiya asks for a teaching of the Buddha, which he does, the Buddha says that he might reap wariness if you were trying to teach Magandiya if he wasn't actually ready. And the third blind person simile is just as a blind person who's given this soiled cloth, once they are able to see, are cured of their blindness, would be angry at the counterfeit cloth that they were given. So too, this is how once one can see clearly, they realize the detriment of former teachings that didn't lead to peace and happiness and contentment. Magandiya hears these, are inspired, asks to go forth. The Buddha gives him the going forth. He goes forth and practices diligent, ardent, resolute, and becomes an arahant. So again, very happy ending.
One of the really interesting parts is how relevant this discussion between the Buddha and Magandiya still is for our moment. The criticism which Magandiya levels at the Buddha of being a destroyer of growth, a killjoy, is a criticism you'll hear leveled at renunciants and their act of renunciation in general, whether it be towards monastics or lay people embarking on this path of kind of relinquishing the sensual pleasures of the world to some extent. And, you know, when Magandiya, the ultimate hippie, as you say, brings this to the Buddha and he says, look, I also have experienced the apex of these sensual pleasures. And now, but after a time, having observed the origination, the cessation, the attraction, the drawback, and the escape of those sensual pleasures, that's the gratification pentad. This way we can look at the full scope of what attracts us and what these sensual pleasures imply, and therefore give them up if they aren't worth the cost, which the Buddha is saying they aren't. Having observed that, I relinquish desire for those sensual pleasures. I observe those beings overcome by the fever of sensual pleasures, and I do not envy them because I abide with a mind stilled, cooled, with a joy apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, which surpasses even divine bliss. Like, what a beautiful phrase. And then the Buddha, using the precision of the simile he uses of a leper, which is the most kind of powerful simile he could use for sensualists like Magandiya, like, you know, this image of a body, and the Magandiya is just very attached to his body. He's rubbing his limbs to show how healthy he is. And for the Buddha to say, no, what you think is you being in a state of health is actually a state of wounds and these open sores. And just the fact that leprosy simile continues to resonate through the teaching, it's such a powerful one, because first, what leprosy does is it numbs the limbs. So the sense like the reason we seek out these burning pleasures is because we actually are numb to truly refined pleasure of internal states of bliss. And then the other aspects of this leprosy simile that the Buddha brings out, the fact that the more we scratch the wound, the more the need to scratch grows. The fact that sensuality is like drinking salt water. And the simple fact about how the Buddha speaks about how the fire of sensual pleasures has always been painful. It's just our perception of it that is distorted. And this harkens to what we call the vipallasa, the distortions of perceiving pain as pleasure, of what is impermanent as permanent, of what is self as not, what is not self as self, and what is repulsive as attractive. These vipallasa, which affect how we perceive the world. And then just the Buddha pointing out this aspect of like, have you ever seen a king enjoying sensual pleasures who manages to also abide devoid of sensual pleasures, sated. And Magandiya admitting no. And this sense of like, we want to have our cake and eat it too. We want to embark and indulge in the world and be able to touch a deeper pleasure. And the Buddha is saying, actually, you have to give up this scratching at the sores before you can really begin to touch these deeper states. You can't, we want to play chess and keep all our pawns, but in the end, you have to renounce something. And then this final kind of place where he has Magandiya request 3 times until Magandiya's last request for teaching is so authentic. May the Buddha teach me so I will not be blind, so that I could see rising from the seat. And that's when the Buddha teaches him. And really making sure that Magandiya is truly open to what he's saying. And then that the Buddha teaches him basically the 4 factors of stream entry, associating with good people, hearing the true Dhamma, practicing the Dhamma rightly, and then he motions towards the 4th factor of stream entry, of appropriate attention. And these 4 factors are said to be the kind of prerequisites for the first level of enlightenment. So Ajahn, what is the word of the week?
The word of the week is samvara. Samvara, which means restraint, or literally holding back or tying down. And it's the type of restraint which leads to freedom. The Buddha praises samvara in many ways, talks about restraining the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind in ways which lead to peace. Also talks about restraining those actions by body, speech, or mind which lead away from peace.
Well, let's do that.